from labor intensive techniques to much more capital intensive techniques. Okay. So that's the first type of unemployment under urban employment. And the second type is that of the educated class. Second type of urban unemployment is of educated class. Second type of urban unemployment is of educated class. In 1951, literacy rate was only 18.33, 18.33%. Okay, which was 18.33% in 1951. It increased to 73% in 2011. Okay, it increased to 73% in 2011. Even when this increased percentage in literacy, even when the educated class got higher in India, still they were not able to provide employment to many people due to the fact that there was a slower growth in private sector. You can write this down. That is, even after the literacy rate going so high from 18% to 73%, even after the literacy rate rising so high or going so high from 18% to 73%, still there was urban unemployment. Still there was urban unemployment, as there was a slow growth in private sector. As there was a slow growth in private sector. As there was a slow growth in private sector, especially in technical, and services sector, especially in technical and services sector. And automatically what will happen then? It will automatically put pressure on the government sector. It laid pressure on the government sector to create more employment opportunities. It automatically gave pressure to the government sector, which was that laid pressure on them to create more employment opportunities. What? Government sector to create more employment opportunities. So what do you think are the causes of unemployment? What can be the causes of unemployment? Unemployment എന്തൊക്കെ കൊണ്ടായിരിക്കും? Yeah, one reason you can write it down: rapid population growth, lack of education, low rate of economic growth, inappropriate technology, inadequate employment planning, Okay, these are the different points which you have: low rate of economic growth, rapid population growth, inappropriate technology, inadequate education policy. I hope you have written that point: inadequate education policy and inadequate employment planning. Inadequate education policy and inadequate employment planning. So last day we discussed about the corporate taxes, the undistributed profits, right? So I hope you haven't noted the definition of undistributed profits, which you can write that right now. That's in the previous chapter, after which we will go to other types of unemployment. So undistributed profits are those profits. Undistributed profits are those profits which is an earned income, which is an earned income, EARNED, earned income, not given to households, not given to households, but kept by a company, but kept by a company for future investment, but kept by a company for future investment. Okay, so that those are the profits earned by a company, and these profits, they are not giving it to their shareholders in the form of dividends also. They are keeping it in their own company for future investments. Okay, they are not using these profits. These are also known as retained earnings. Okay, retained earnings, you can write it down. Undistributed profits are also known as retained earnings, or it's a retained form of income. Okay, now you may come back to what we've been discussing about unemployment. Now we'll study certain terms related to that. The first one is the labor force participation rate. Labor force participation rate. LFPR, labor force participation rate. You can note down the definition. Labor force refers to the population. Labor force refers to the population which supplies or offers to supply. ഒന്നെങ്കിൽ സപ്ലൈ ചെയ്യും അല്ലെങ്കിൽ സപ്ലൈ ചെയ്യാൻ ഓഫർ ചെയ്യും. Which supplies or offers to supply labor. Which supplies or offers to supply labor for pursuing economic activities. For pursuing economic activities. For the production of goods and services. For the production of goods and services. And therefore includes for the production of goods and services. For the production of goods and services. And therefore includes both employed and unemployed persons. I'll read that once again. Labor force refers to the population which supplies or offers to supply labor for pursuing economic activities for the production of goods and services, and therefore includes both employed and unemployed persons. Okay, so this labor force participation rate is actually a rate at which the labor force is supplied. Okay, it is the rate at which labor force is supplied to a population, refers to the population where they supply population or they offer to supply. Okay, where they supply or offer to supply for pursuing economic activities. Okay, it is for pursuing certain activities that they supply or they offer to supply. And what are these economic activities? It's related to the production of goods and services. Okay, for the production of goods and services, and therefore it includes both employed and unemployed people. Okay, so that's the thing regarding labor force participation rate. We'll come back to that once again after discussing worker population ratio. Worker population ratio, that is WPR, worker population ratio. The estimates of employed the estimates of employed in bracket you can write down worker, the estimates of employed in bracket you can write down worker according to the usual principal status gives the number of persons who worked for a relatively long part of the 365 days preceding the date of survey. Okay, and this can include two types of people. Either the people who worked for a relatively long part of the 365 days, and second, also those people from among the remaining population who had worked at least for 30 days during the reference period of the 365 days. I mean, to the total reference period of 365 days. To the total reference period of 365 days. So as these words say, labor force participation ratio അല്ലെങ്കിൽ LFPR എന്ന് പറയുന്നത് എത്രത്തോളം ആൾക്കാർ ലേബർ ഫോഴ്സിൽ എംപ്ലോയിഡ് ആയിട്ടുണ്ട് ടു ദ ടോട്ടൽ നമ്പർ ഓഫ് പേഴ്സൺസ്. ഓക്കെ, ദാറ്റ് ഇസ് ഇറ്റ്. പ്രപ്പോർഷൻ ഓഫ് പീപ്പിൾ ഓർ പേഴ്സൺസ് ഇൻ ദി ലേബർ ഫോഴ്സ് ടു ദ ടോട്ടൽ നമ്പർ ഓഫ് പേഴ്സൺസ്. അതാണ് LFPR എന്ന് പറയുന്ന റേറ്റ്. ഓക്കെ, ദാറ്റ് ഇസ് എ ലേബർ ഫോഴ്സ് പാർട്ടിസിപ്പേഷൻ റേറ്റ്. വർക്കർ പോപ്പുലേഷൻ റേഷ്യോ എന്ന് പറയുമ്പോൾ ഹൗ മെനി പീപ്പിൾ ആർ വർക്കിംഗ്, ഓക്കെ, ഹൗ മെനി പീപ്പിൾ ആർ ഇൻവോൾവ് ഇൻ ദ വർക്ക് ഫോഴ്സ്. അതിനെ നമ്മൾ രണ്ടായിട്ട് കാറ്റഗറൈസ് ചെയ്യുന്നു. പീപ്പിൾ ഹു വർക്ക് ഫോർ റിലേറ്റീവ്ലി എ ലോങ് പാർട്ട് ഓഫ് ദോസ് 365 ഡേയ്സ്. ഒരു വർഷത്തിൽ 365 ദിവസം ഉണ്ടെങ്കിൽ അതിൽ കൂടുതൽ എത്ര റിലേറ്റീവ്ലി ലോങ് പാർട്ട് എന്ന് പറയുമ്പോൾ അതിന്റെ മോർ ദാൻ ഹാഫ്, ദാറ്റ് ഇസ് മോർ ദാൻ ഹാഫ് ഓഫ് 365 എത്രത്തോളം ആൾക്കാർ വർക്ക് ചെയ്യുന്നു. And for those people who work for relatively lesser period of time, that is maybe 30 days to that of 365 days. Okay, that is the worker population ratio. Worker population എന്ന് പറയുമ്പോൾ എത്ര പേര് വർക്ക് ചെയ്യുന്നു to that of the total population. Labor force participation ratio എന്ന് പറയുമ്പോൾ how many people are involved in the labor force to that of the total persons. Okay, അതിന്റെ proportion ആണ് labor force participation rate. The next one is the very important thing and the very easiest thing for you now, unemployment rate. Unemployment rate, which is also known as UR. You can write the short form if you want. Unemployment rate. UR is the ratio. UR is the ratio. What will be the ratio between? It's unemployment rate. So yeah, it's the ratio of unemployment people or unemployed persons to the total number of persons in labor force. To the total number of persons who are there in the labor force. So I hope it's clear. And unemployment rate can also be understood by analyzing LFPR and worker population ratio, WPR. Okay. So those two can be taken as measures to understand the unemployment rate. If you want, you can write it down. Those two, that is LFPR and WPR, can be taken as measures to understand or to analyze unemployment rate. Okay. That is labor force participation rate and the worker population rate. Those two can be used as measures to understand the unemployment rate, the total unemployment rate of a country or of a state. Next is the employment elasticity. Employment elasticity. Employment elasticity is the measurement. It is the measurement. It is the measurement of percentage change. It is the measurement of percentage change in employment. In employment with increase in GDP. With increase in GDP. Increase, okay, increase in GDP. Okay, so basically, what does employment elasticity tell? It is a measurement of percentage change. Okay, what does it analyze to that percentage changes? It is the employment to that of the increase in GDP. GDP കൂടുന്നതിനനുസരിച്ച് employment കൂടുന്നുണ്ടോ? Okay, അതിന്റെ percentage change ആണ് എന്ത്? That is employment elasticity. Elasticity, the word itself means a percentage change. Price elasticity എന്നാണ് നമ്മൾ പറയുന്നതെന്നുണ്ടെങ്കിൽ the change in price to that of the changing demand. Okay, so അതുപോലെ employment elasticity എന്ന് പറയുമ്പോൾ it is again the measurement of percentage change in the employment with respect to or with increase in GDP. GDP-യിൽ increase ഉണ്ടാകുന്നത് കൊണ്ട് employment-ൽ എന്ത് മാറ്റമാണ് ഉണ്ടാകുന്നത്? What percentage change? Positive ആകാം, negative ആകാം. Okay. Okay, so you can write down that the similar trends have been witnessed, or the trends have been witnessed at the sectoral level. The trends have been witnessed at the sectoral level. Sector sectoral level, namely agriculture sector, agriculture sector, service sector, and manufacturing sector. And you can write down in the context of India, in the service sector and manufacturing sector or industrial sector. In the context of India, in agriculture and manufacturing, or in agriculture and industrial sector, employment elasticity and agriculture and manufacturing sector, employment elasticity is mostly negative. Employment elasticity is mostly negative. And mostly negative, it indicates that there is a movement of people. Yeah. There is a movement of people from agriculture to service sector, or manufacturing sector to service sector. That is what is indicated. So what should we have in hand to solve this issue? When people from agriculture sector, from one sector move to another sector, I mean, agriculture sector should also have a minimum number of people, right? So what we should have is, we should have a surplus number of workers in every industry, so that this don't fall down. Okay, we should have a surplus of workers, and that can be the solution for this. We should have a surplus of workers to other sectors for productive and gainful employment. For productive and gainful employment which is necessary for inclusive growth. Which is necessary for inclusive growth. Productive and gainful employment. Productive and gainful employment is necessary for inclusive growth. And negative employment, okay, this negative employment has been a major cause of concern, especially in the manufacturing sector. This negative employment elasticity, manufacturing sector is where India has lacked its focus on. So negative employment elasticity in manufacturing sector is a cause of concern, particularly when the sector has achieved higher growth rates. Particularly when the sector has achieved higher growth rates during the past couple of decades. Manufacturing sector is a cause of concern. Manufacturing sector is a cause of concern, particularly when the sector has achieved higher growth rates during the past couple of decades. Okay, so just now we discussed the employment elasticity, and in which we told that elasticity is basically percentage change. So what does employment elasticity mean? It is the percentage change in, it's the percentage change in employment with respect to a increase in GDP, okay? And that percentage change can be both positive as well as negative. It depends upon the situation, okay? So if it's negative, what does it mean? People are moving out of that sector to another sector. So we require a surplus of workers in every sector so that there is a positive chance for inclusive growth. Okay, inclusive growth of all the sectors is one of the key focus or objectives of Indian economy. So for that, for maintaining or for achieving that inclusive growth, we require surplus of workers in every sector. ഓരോ സെക്ടർ എടുത്താൽ അഗ്രികൾച്ചർ സെക്ടറിൽ ഇപ്പൊ നെഗറ്റീവ് എംപ്ലോയ്മെന്റ് ഇലാസ്റ്റിസിറ്റി ആണെന്ന് പറഞ്ഞാൽ it means that agriculture sector നിന്ന് മാനുഫാക്ചറിംഗ് സെക്ടറിലേക്കോ അല്ലെങ്കിൽ സർവീസ് സെക്ടറിലേക്കോ ആൾക്കാർ അവരുടെ ഫോക്കസ് ഷിഫ്റ്റ് ചെയ്യുന്നു. They are moving out of that sector to the other sector for jobs, which means that നമുക്ക് എല്ലാ സെക്ടറിലും inclusive ആയിട്ട് കൊണ്ടുപോകണം, അല്ലെങ്കിൽ inclusive growth is what we are trying to achieve. If we need that, we need a surplus of workers. Okay, so that's it. Now we can take down the employment unemployment situation. The employment unemployment situation. There is a bit of data which you have to write down. The unemployment rate. The heading is the employment unemployment situation. Okay. The unemployment rate. The unemployment rate was estimated to be, for unemployment rate and all you write UR. The unemployment rate was estimated to be 5%. The unemployment rate was estimated to be 5% at the all India level. Or in other words, 5% of the persons, 5% of the persons aged 15 years or above, aged 15 years or above and above, who were available for work, could not get work during the reference period. What did we study as the definition for involuntary unemployment, or basically unemployment? Even when people want to be a part of the labor force, they are not able to get jobs. Okay, that is the basic definition. And look at here, what we have said is the same thing. That is 5% of the people aged 15 or above Even when they are trying or even when they are available for work, they are not getting the work during the reference period. That reference period can be 1 year or so. Okay. And in rural sector, in rural sector, unemployment rate, you just write UR was 5.1%. Whereas in urban sector, UR was 4.9%. And now when we take a gender connection to that, the unemployment rate was higher in females or higher among females. The unemployment rate UR was higher among females as compared to males. Okay. So these are the basic statistics under the employment and unemployment situation of India. This is the current status. Okay. And whenever we look, we can understand that the female unemployment rate has always been greater than the male unemployment rate. Even when more males are involved in agriculture sector or the service sector or any other sectors, if we look, that has been the nature of India, but still female unemployment rate has been high. Okay. So someone please summarize what we have learned is in this unemployment chapter, after which we'll move to the next topic of poverty. Someone please summarize. Someone please volunteer and start reading out. Tanmay, you may read. Okay. So now we'll study the next topic of this chapter. There are three topics: unemployment, poverty, and inequality. The next topic of consideration, which we are going to study right now, is poverty. Okay. So you all know what poverty is. What is it? What is poverty? It is the inability to secure the minimum. right? When a person is unable to secure the minimum needs, the basic needs that are required, he or she is said to be poor or is under the poverty condition. So you can write it down. It is the inability. Poverty is a situation, or poverty may be defined as the inability to secure the minimum consumption requirements, for life, health, and efficiency. For life, health, and efficiency. So what are these minimum consumption requirements, or what are these basic necessities which a man should have? Food, shelter, clothing, okay, those type of things, education, health, these type of things are something which every person in this India, not only India, in this world should have access to. Okay, so these are the basic elements: food, housing, clothing, education, health, etc. Okay. And when poverty is there in a country, it also means that there can be a chance of low productivity. Okay. When poverty is prevalent in a country, it also means that there can be a chance of low productivity due to the fact that those people are not able to meet the basic needs or the basic requirements which a man should have. They might not be able to work in the fashion a person who is really able is able to work. Okay. I hope you understand the concept. Poverty is also related to low productivity due to the fact that a person who is not able to meet the basic needs of life, like food, housing, clothing, etc., then how will he able to do the work as properly? So it is also related to or interlinked to low productivity. Okay. And in the context of India and in the general terms, there are two types of poverty. Relative and absolute. Relative poverty and absolute poverty. Relative poverty as well as absolute poverty. Okay, so what is relative poverty? What is relative poverty? Relative, or if you are comparing someone to someone, that is the basic example I can give you. Then what is relative poverty? Relative poverty. That it's also there from that word, so you'll get it. Relative poverty means in comparison to another person, you are poor. Okay. For example, you take a billionaire or a millionaire, and when you compare yourself, or if for example, I'll take a neutral example, person A is considered to be a billionaire, and person B is a person who earns maybe 1 lakh or 2 lakh per month. Okay. When he compares himself to a billionaire, he is considered poor. Okay, he is relatively poor. That is in comparison to another person who is relatively richer than him. That is the basic thing. Okay, so you can write down relative poverty. It views poverty, relative poverty, it views poverty as socially defined. It views poverty as socially defined and dependent on social context. Socially defined and dependent on social context. And relative poverty is also a measure of income inequality. It views poverty as a socially defined and dependent on social context. Defined and dependent on social context. Relative poverty is also a measure of income inequality. Relative poverty is also a measure of income inequality. And this is the basic definition. Relative poverty is measured as the percentage of population. Relative poverty is measured as the percentage of population with an income with an income less than the fixed proportion of median income. With an income less than the fixed proportion. With an income less than the fixed proportion of median income. So this is the basic understanding from relative poverty. You are comparing two people. If you seem poor to him in terms of his income, then you are said to be relatively poor. Okay. If the other median, MEDIAN, median income. That's the basic definition of that. The basic meaning which you have to understand from this is, in comparison to one person, are you getting the same income as of him? If not, you are relatively poor. Okay. That's it. And the next one is absolute poverty. Absolute poverty. Actually, we told that unemployment itself relates to involuntary unemployment, right? Likewise, this poverty itself is absolute poverty. Poverty is also known as absolute poverty. And it means when people are not able to get to a minimum level of consumption. Okay, you are not relating to anyone, you are not comparing to anyone. ഒരാള് അയാളെ തന്നെ അനലൈസ് ചെയ്യുമ്പോൾ if he or she is not able to meet the basic necessities of life, that is absolute poverty, and that is same as what poverty is. Okay, so you may write down it's as same as poverty when someone is not able to meet the basic consumption standards. So we have already told many a times in this poverty situation that there is a minimum consumption line, there is a minimum consumption pattern, basic necessities of life. So in the context of India, it is very difficult to define a minimum consumption line. Okay, different persons' consumption depends. It depends. My consumption pattern might not be yours, might not be yours. It is different. It is different for different people. So we need to have a standardized ratio for that. Okay, if a person has such and such or qualities, or if he has maintained such and such, if he is able to achieve such and such basic necessities, okay, we'll say that he is not poor. But if we are of the view that one person is having such and such income and the other person is not having that, we are comparing it to one person, it is relatively poor. So what is that minimum consumption line? What is that minimum consumption pattern? What are the basic necessities? These should be clearly defined. Okay. And in the Indian context, there is a concern regarding that. Okay. So you can write down a concern or as a problem of in the Indian context of poverty. It is very difficult to define a minimum consumption line. It is very difficult to define a minimum consumption line. In that context, can we even take two countries for a reason? Can we tell that India is relatively poor to USA? No, because USA's consumption pattern might be different. Our consumption pattern might be different. So what has to be that standardized consumption line is something which has to be brought into consideration while studying poverty. Okay. Next, you can note down the World Bank's poverty line. World Bank's poverty line. World Bank define extreme poverty. World Bank, you can write down WB. WBX defined extreme poverty. WBX defined extreme poverty. Extreme poverty line for the first time. Extreme poverty line for the first time in 1990. 1990, okay, 1990. For the first time in 1990 at $1 person per day. At $1 person per day. At $1 person per day. And they revise it accordingly as the day progresses, as the year progresses. Okay, because the living standards are different. The living standards improve across years. So they change it accordingly. Since 2008, but still we can have a data regarding that. Since 2008, $1.25, $1.25, $1.25 was the extreme poverty line. Extreme poverty line. Extreme poverty line of the World Bank. And as of October 2015, it was updated to $1.9, $1.90 per person per day. ഒരാൾക്ക് ഒരു ദിവസം $1, $1.9 എങ്കിലും കിട്ടാൻ സാധിച്ചാൽ it's okay. It's not below the poverty line. And the World Bank has set certain limits for different countries also. Okay. So the categorization of countries are as follows: lower middle income countries. That is World Bank's classification. Okay. World Bank's classification on the basis of countries. Lower middle income countries. Lower middle income countries will have $3.2 per person per day. $3.2 per person per day. Lower middle income countries will have, you can put a hyphen and write $3.2 per person per day. When it comes to the case of high middle income countries, high middle income countries, it is $5.5 per person per day. Okay. $5.5. $5.5. And in the case of high income countries, not middle income, high income countries, that's the third classification. High income countries, it is $21.7 per person per day. This $21.7 per person per day. Okay. So the World Bank has classified, World Bank's classification is based on the people as well as on the basis of countries also. So we have already told that for attaining or for understanding a minimum consumption line, we require to have a basic standardized rate or a basic standardized income to set the statement that such and such people fall below the poverty line. Maybe 1 million people are above the poverty line. Okay, for example. So that is required. And there are many, instruments like Lorentz curve, Gini coefficient, etc. So you can write down Lorentz curve. Huh? Lower middle income countries. Are you asking about the classification? India actually belongs to the high middle income countries. It was in the lower middle income countries. Now it has improved the high middle income. Lorentz curve. Okay, so Lorentz curve is a graphical representation of inequality. Lorentz curve is a graphical representation of inequality. For example, personal incomes of a country, personal incomes in a country, personal incomes in a country are arranged in ascending order. Personal incomes in a country are arranged in an ascending order. And the cumulative share of total income and the cumulative share of total income is plotted against the cumulative share of population. Cumulative share of total income is plotted against the cumulative share of total population. The slope of this curve, the slope of this curve, the slope of this curve is thus proportional. The slope of this curve is thus proportional to per capita income. Proportional to per capita income at each point of population distribution. At each point of population distribution. And if there is a complete equality, if there is a complete equality of income, if there is a complete equality of income, the Lorentz curve would be a straight line. Completely equal ആണ് income inequality 0 ആണെന്നുണ്ടെങ്കിൽ Lorentz curve would be a straight line. Okay. And it becomes more curved as inequality increases. Inequality കൂടുന്നതിനനുസരിച്ച് Lorentz curve ചെയ്യും. The curve would be greater when the inequality increases. So what is basically Lorentz curve? It's a graphical representation of inequality. Inequality graphically represent ചെയ്യുന്നു. So obviously inequality to that of the population. Income inequality to that of the population ആയിരിക്കും measure ചെയ്യുന്നത്. Income inequality 0 ആണെന്നുണ്ടെങ്കിൽ ഒരു കൺട്രിയിൽ income inequality ഇല്ല എന്നുണ്ടെങ്കിൽ it will be a straight line. And if there is income inequality, it would be curved. Okay, curved ആകും. ആ curve sharpen ചെയ്യും as the income inequality rises. Okay. Next is Gini coefficient. GINI coefficient. Gini coefficient. Gini coefficient and Lorentz curve are interrelated actually. Gini coefficient is calculated using the Lorentz curve. Gini coefficient is calculated using the Lorentz curve. Gini coefficient is calculated using the Lorentz curve. In this curve, Gini coefficient is the ratio of area. Gini coefficient is the ratio of area between the diagonal. Gini coefficient is the ratio of area between the diagonal and the Lorentz curve. Between the diagonal and the Lorentz curve to the total area under the diagonal. Okay, so it is calculated using the Lorentz curve, and in this curve, Gini coefficient is the ratio of area between the diagonal and the Lorentz curve. And Lorentz curve നമ്മൾ വരയ്ക്കുകയാണ്, and if diagonal distance കൂടുന്തോറും income inequality കൂടുന്നു. Okay, and I'll show you a graphical representation of that. And as the distance between the diagonal and the Lorentz curve decreases, it shows a decrease in income inequality. Okay, or a rise in equality. Next is poverty line. These are certain statements, okay, the concepts related to poverty. Poverty line. So poverty line would be measuring what? Poverty. And how would we measure that? It is the income level. It is the income level. It is the income level just sufficient. It is the income level just sufficient to avoid inadequate consumption. So we are having an income level to avoid inadequate consumption, just sufficient to avoid inadequate consumption. So poverty level, poverty line, as you all know, measures poverty. What do we take into consideration? The income level. If the income level is able to satisfy the so-called basic necessities of life, then it is above the poverty line. If it's not so, it's below the poverty line. That's how we have class distinction also. So different countries have different levels of poverty line, and poverty level line, we'll discuss it later. The next thing which you can write down is head count ratio. HCR, head count ratio. Head count ratio is the percentage of people. For writing percentage and all, you put that symbol of percentage. Percentage of people or percentage of population living below the poverty line. Percentage of people or population living below the poverty line in any country. Okay, it's the percentage of people living below the poverty line. Okay, BPL category, Indian context BPL category, that is what head count ratio measures. So if the HCR rises, what will happen? If head count ratio rises, it means that there are more people below the poverty line, okay, and vice versa. Poverty gap index. Poverty gap index. Poverty gap index is also known as the poverty gap ratio, okay? It is also known as the poverty gap ratio. It is defined as the average of the ratio of poverty average of the ratio of poverty gap to that of poverty line. Average of ratio of poverty gap to poverty line. Average of ratio of poverty gap to that of poverty line. It is expressed as a percentage. Poverty gap index ratio. So it's expressed as a percentage of poverty line for a country or region. ഒരു പോവർട്ടി ലൈനിന്റെ പെർസെന്റേജിനാണ് ശരിക്കും ഈ പോവർട്ടി ഗ്യാപ്പ് ഇൻഡെക്സ് എന്ന് പറയുന്നത്. And the most common way of measuring poverty, okay, the most common method of measuring poverty is by using the HCR or head count ratio. The most common method of measuring poverty is by using HCR or head count ratio. So what is HCR? What is head count ratio? Below the poverty line. So what is its disadvantage? Is it that, I mean, there might be, if for example, if we are taking 100 people and 80 people fall below the poverty line, okay? So the HCR or the head count ratio shows that 80 people are below the poverty line, but it doesn't show the depth of poverty they are involved in, okay? Some people might be very poor, some people might not be that poor, some might be relatively poor. It depends, the depth of poverty depends, right? It doesn't measure that. You can write down under HCR or here. It doesn't measure the HCR is a good index, but it does not measure the depth of poverty. It ignores the depth of poverty, or it does not measure the depth of poverty. From a depth of poverty, what do you understand from that? Poor ആയിട്ടുള്ള ഒരാൾ വീണ്ടും poor ആയാലും head count ratio അത് reflect ചെയ്യില്ല. Even if the poor becomes poorer, it will not be reflected in the HCR because he is already stated as poor. The depth of poverty is not analyzed. So even if the poor becomes poorer, the HCR doesn't take into account of that. Okay. But the poverty gap index, that's a comparison between HCR and poverty gap index. The poverty gap index provides a clearer perspective. The poverty gap index provides a clearer perspective on the depth of poverty. Poverty gap index provides a clear perspective on the depth of poverty. It also helps. It also helps to provide. It also helps to provide an overall assessment. It also helps to provide an overall assessment of a region's progress. Of a region's progress in poverty alleviation. Poverty alleviation എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞാൽ poverty കുറയ്ക്കുന്നതിനുള്ള measures. Poverty alleviation. ALLEVIATION. Poverty alleviation and the evaluation of. Poverty alleviation and the evaluation of specific public policies and initiatives. Specific public policies and initiatives. So what is Lawrence curve? What does it measure? What does Lawrence curve measure? Inequality. It's a graphical representation of inequality. The personal incomes of people in a country are arranged. And if there is no inequality, then the Lawrence curve would be a straight line. And the curve sharpens or deepens as the inequality rises. Okay. That's regarding the Lawrence curve. Gini coefficient is taken into consideration under the Lawrence curve. When Lawrence curve is plotted, we can take the Gini coefficient from that. It is the difference between the diagonal. It is the difference between the diagonal and the area of the diagonal and the poverty line, the exact poverty line. Okay. And if the area between these two rises, it means that there is a rise in poverty. If it lowers, it means there is a rise in equality or there is lowering inequality. Okay. Then next we studied about the head count ratio, the HCR. HCR, what does it show? It's the ratio. It's the ratio of the people who fall below the poverty line. But the disadvantage of that is that the depth of poverty is ignored. Okay. We do not study about the depth of poverty. So if a person who was poor becomes poorer, if a person who was poor again becomes poorer, it's not measured in that. But that's the advantage of poverty gap index. It measures that. It measures the depth of poverty. It analyzes the depth of poverty. If a person falls from poverty to below, I mean, from poor to a poorer condition, the poverty gap index or the poverty gap ratio analyzes that. Okay, that's the difference. Next up, we have an index based on that. As we studied the Human Development Index, the poverty line or the poverty is analyzed by the multi-dimensional poverty index, MPI. Multi-dimensional poverty index. Multi-dimensional poverty index, MPI. This index has been developed by the Oxford Poverty. This index has been developed by the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative. And Human Development Initiative. The new MPI, that is the multi-dimensional poverty index, has replaced, MPI has replaced Human Poverty Index, HPI. HPI was what we had. MPI is something new. So it has replaced HPI or Human Poverty Index in the Human Development Report of the UNDP. Okay, it has replaced Human Poverty Index in the Human Development Report. In the Human Development Report of the United Nations Development Program, that is UNDP, United Nations Development Program. Human Development Report of the UNDP, that is United Nations Development Program. So what all might be the things which this MPI analyzes? We have already told in HDI, Human Development Index, that it analyzes education, literacy. The same here, it's health, education, and standard of living. Okay. The dimensions of MPI: health, education, and standard of living. Health, education, and standard of living. These are the three measures of MPI. These are the three measures of MPI. And they have been measured using another 10 parameters. These three measures have been analyzed or understood or measured using 10 parameters. First parameter is education. 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 Years of schooling. Second parameter is years of schooling. എത്ര വർഷം സ്കൂളിംഗ് ചെയ്തിട്ടുണ്ട്? Child enrollment. Child enrollment. ENROLLLMENT. Child enrollment. സ്കൂളിൽ എൻറോൾ ചെയ്തിട്ടുണ്ടോ എന്നുള്ളത് നോക്കുന്നത്. ഫോർത്ത് പാരാമീറ്റർ ഹെൽത്ത്. Fifth parameter is child mortality. That is children's death. Child mortality. Nutrition. Nutrition. Standard of living. Standard of living. Electricity. Electricity. Drinking water. Sanitation. Housing. Cooking fuel. Assets. There are basically 10 important parameters from which they analyze among these. Okay. So these are the different parameters, the overall parameters which are looked in MPI to measure the basic three measures which we already told. That is health, education, and standard of living. Okay. Education is taken. Years of schooling are taken. How many years of schooling have they completed? Health, child mortality, these are things, nutrition, standard of living, electricity, and drinking water is a very major point. And in drinking water, what you have to understand is that a person is said to be deprived if he or she does not have access. A person is said to be deprived in the case of drinking water if he or she does not have access to clean drinking water. If he or she does not have access to clean drinking water, without a 30 minutes walk from home. Without a 30 minutes walk from home. Walk, okay, WALK, walk from home. Okay, then sanitation, housing, cooking fuel, and assets. Okay, so these are the things which comes under as the parameters, as several parameters of measuring multidimensional poverty index. So this is actually multidimensional poverty index is a really good index as compared to the previous index which we had, that was the human poverty index, because a person can be said to be poor in a lot of terms, not only in terms of income, but in terms of the education. That can all be factors which made him poor. Education, years of schooling, sanitation, is he having good access to drinking water, is he having a good housing facility, sanitation, etc. So what we have to understand that this is a multi-dimensional poverty index. So this actually is inclusive. This includes all types of indexes or parameters out of which they use the basic or the important 10 parameters to analyze the three factors which we told as health, education, and standard of living. Okay, so that's it regarding multi-dimensional poverty index. And next we'll study about the Engel's law. ENGEL apostrophe S. ENGEL apostrophe S. Engel's law or Angel's law. Engel's law. ENGEL apostrophe S law. According to this law, as income of the poor family increase, as income of the poor families increase, poor families in the income increase, as income of the poor families increase, they increase their share of spending. They increase their share of spending. They increase their share of spending on non-food items. Food items അല്ലാത്ത കാര്യങ്ങൾ അവർ spend ചെയ്യാൻ തുടങ്ങും on non-food items. Or in other words, in simple terms, at a low level of income, I hope you got a basic definition of that. At a low, in other words, at a low level of income, they would be spending more on food items. But when the income starts to rise, but when the income starts rising, income കൂടാൻ തുടങ്ങുമ്പോഴത്തേക്കും they try to spend on other items they try to spend on non-food items or other items so as to make them developed in the economy. So as to make them developed in the economy. Next point which you can write under Engel's law is that the share of food expenditure slowly starts to decline. Can you repeat that sentence? Other items? Other items, yeah. And the food expenditure in the total expenditure, the food expenditure in the total expenditure starts to decline. The food expenditure in the total expenditure starts to decline. That is a very simple concept. I mean, when you have a very low income, you focus on having food. You focus on at least completing a day. You focus on completing a day's life. For that, you need food. So your expenditure, whatever money you get, that will be focused on food. As slowly the income of the poor households increases. 10 രൂപ പണ്ട് കിട്ടിക്കൊണ്ടിരുന്ന സ്ഥലത്ത് ഇപ്പം 100 രൂപ 200 രൂപയോ കിട്ടുന്നുണ്ടെങ്കിൽ you will start to ഒരു കൺസംഷൻ കാണും. ഫുഡിന് വേണ്ടിയിട്ട് ഒരു എക്സ്പെൻഡിച്ചർ കാണും. But still you will start to purchase some other things which makes you stand developed in the economy. Maybe that might be your clothing. That can be a starting your housing, sanitation facilities, basic toilet facilities, etc. So these type of things start to happen in your household when your income slowly starts to rise. Okay, unless and until you need to satisfy the basic necessities of life, and the most basic necessity is food and drinking water, without which you cannot survive a day. So your food expenditure, your expenditure on food slowly starts to decline as your income rises. Okay, so this shows an inverse proportion. Okay, so Engel's law also shows an inverse proportion. It also shows an inverse proportion. It also shows an inverse proportion between rise in income. എന്ത് തമ്മിലാണ് inverse proportion between rise in income and food expenditure. Income കൂടുന്തോറും food expenditure കുറയും. ഫുഡിന്റെ expenditure കുറയും. ഫുഡിന്റെ expenditure കുറയുന്നു എന്ന് പറയുമ്പോൾ the basic concept which you need to have in your mind is 10 രൂപ കിട്ടുന്ന ഒരു സ്ഥലത്ത് ഒരാൾ 10 രൂപയ്ക്കും ഫുഡിനായിരിക്കും ചെലവാക്കുന്നത്. Okay, but you take 10 as a good amount. Okay, when it increases to 100, he might still require to eat for maybe a 20 or 30 rupees. Baki or 70 he might have in hand. Okay. After completing his hunger. Our ഒരു 60 to 70 rupees, if he have that in hand, he can use it for his own development purposes. So basically food expenditure decline ചെയ്യുന്നു നമ്മൾ പറയുന്നത്. Food expenditure അപ്പോഴും ഉണ്ട്. പക്ഷെ income rise ചെയ്യുന്നതുകൊണ്ട് he will be able to use this income for other activities also. That is a basic concept. Next up is the evolution of measurement of poverty in India. Poverty has been measured in different aspects in India. The evolution of measurement of poverty in India. Evolution of measurement of poverty in India. The Planning Commission. The Planning Commission is the nodal agency. The Planning Commission is the nodal agency, NODAL, nodal agency in the government of India for the estimation of poverty. That was the situation of India, but we do not have a planning commission now. We have Niti Aayog instead of planning commission. Okay. So it estimates the incidence of poverty. It estimates the incidence of poverty at the national and state level. It estimates the incidence of poverty at the national and state level. Separately in rural and urban areas. At the national and state level, separately in rural and urban areas. Separately in rural and urban areas. The incidence of poverty. The incidence of poverty is measured by the poverty ratio. The incidence of poverty is measured by the poverty ratio. And what is poverty ratio? It is the ratio of poor people to that of the total population. So may I write it down? It is the ratio of number of poor, or it is the ratio of number of poor people to that of the total population. For ratio, it will also be expressed in terms of percentage. It is a ratio of total number of poor people. It is a ratio of total number of poor people to that of the total population in an area. To that of the total population in an area, expressed in terms of percentage. The poverty ratio is measured. The poverty ratio is measured from an. The poverty ratio is measured from an exogenously determined. The poverty ratio is measured from an exogenously determined poverty line. From an exogenously determined poverty line, quantified in terms of per capita consumption expenditure. Quantified in terms of per capita consumption expenditure. Quantified in terms of per capita consumption expenditure. Okay, so we are understanding about the evolution of planning commission in India. This is a bit of a dry topic and it's mostly of theory. So we have had different groups to analyze, okay, different committees to analyze or to estimate the poverty. We need a committee to estimate the poverty estimation. We have already told we require to understand poverty, we require a minimum consumption line. Okay. For that, we took the World Bank's classification to analyze the minimum consumption line. Likewise, to analyze the poverty, to estimate the poverty in India, we have different groups and different committees. Okay. So the first group which you can write down is the working group of 1962. Working group, WORKING, working group 1962. The planning commission, for now you know what is planning commission, you just write PC or something. The planning commission constituted a working group. The planning commission constituted a working group in 1962. It's very important to study the name and the formation here. Okay. Working group in 1962 to find out a desirable minimum level, to find out a desirable minimum level, to find out a minimum desirable minimum level of living for the population. What would be the desirable minimum level of living of the population for the population? Okay. Desirable minimum level of living for the population. So what was the recommendation? You can write down recommendations. The recommendations of the working group were: national minimum consumption expenditure. National minimum consumption expenditure. National minimum consumption expenditure. National minimum consumption expenditure for a household. For a household. For a household of 5 persons. For a household of 5 persons. For a household of 5 persons should not be less than rupees 100 per month. Should not be less than rupees 100 per month. For urban areas, this figure was rupees 125 per month. For urban areas, this figure was rupees 125 per month, or rupees 25 per capita, or rupees 25 per capita per month. Per capita means per person. Okay. Or rupees 25 per capita per month to cover the higher prices there. To cover the higher prices there. And their poverty line excluded. Their poverty line excluded expenditure. Their poverty line excluded expenditure on health and education. They excluded health and education, both of which they excluded health and education, both of which it was assumed were to be provided by the state. Avara exclude the poverty line. What did they exclude? Health and education. Why did they exclude? Due to the fact that they believe that it would be provided by the state. They believe that it would be provided by the state. State government provide they excluded it from the poverty line. What did they exclude? Health and education. They also took into account, working group also took into account the recommendation, also took into account the recommendation of balanced diet, made by the Nutrition Advisory Committee or Nutrition Advisory Group, not committee, okay, Nutrition Advisory Group of the ICMR. That is the Indian Council of Medical Research. That is, they also took into account the recommendation of the balanced diet made by the Nutrition Advisory Group of the Indian Council of Medical Research. Indian Council of Medical Research is also known as ICMR, which occurred in 1958. In 1958. And when was this poverty line used? Which was estimated by the working group. It was used during the period of 1960s and 70s. Okay. It was used during the period of 1960s and 70s. Obviously, due to the reason that it was formed in 1962. Okay. So whenever you understand these type of poverty, evolution of poverty groups, or the evolution of how poverty estimation has been there in India, besides each of the things you write, okay, working group 1962, when was it formed, for what purpose was it formed, what were their basic recommendations, and what did they exclude from their poverty line, health and education, why did they exclude? When you are able to understand these WH questions, okay, what, when, where, why, how, you will be able to comprehend it easily, and you will be able to memorize it easily. Okay, but so besides this evolution of planning commission, you can take down these questions: what, where, when, why, and how. You understand, once you understand these type of questions, it is easily to comprehend. Okay, it's easy to comprehend. We also have the task force of 1979, Gallup committee, the expert group committee of 1993 coming up. So we'll analyze that after the break. Okay, so we'll have a break till 12 noon, and we'll start by 12. Okay, so we'll resume the class. So we were talking about the working group of 1962, right? We were talking about the working group of 1962. The next group or the next force which we'll study is the task force of 1979. Okay, the task force of 1979, TASK force 1979. It is also known as the ALAG committee, ALAGH. ALAGH, ALAG committee or task force of 1979. Okay, so the planning commission in July 1977, the planning commission in July 1977 constituted the task force. The planning commission in July 1977 constituted the task force on, you can put an inverted comma and write, projections of minimum needs and effective consumption demand. Projections on minimum needs and effective consumption demand. Under the chairmanship of, did you write that? Projections of minimum needs and effective consumption demand under the chairmanship of Dr. Y.K. Alak. Dr. Y.K. Alak, ALAGH. And the task force submitted its report in January 1979. The task force submitted its report in January 1979. And the planning commission accepted its recommendations. Our report submitted in 1979, January 1979, and the planning commission accepted all its recommendations in the same month itself. Okay, so we'll see the recommendations. You can write down recommendations of the task force of 1979 or the ALAG committee. First recommendation was that the average calorie requirements were estimated separately for the all India rural and urban areas. Separately for the all India rural and urban areas. Rural and urban areas as a population. It's a single sentence. All India rural and urban areas as a population weighted average. As a population weighted average. As a population weighted average of the age gender activity. As a population weighted average of the age gender activity. Age, put a hyphen, gender activity. Age gender activity. Age gender activity, specific calorie awareness. And allowances. Recommended by the nutrition expert group. With reference to the 1971 population census. Nutrition expert group with reference to the 1971 population census. With reference to the 1971 population census. Nutrition expert group with reference to the 1971 population census. That was their first recommendation. Okay, that was the first recommendation of task force. It came into existence in 1979. It was also known as Alak Committee and it was under the able chairmanship of Dr. Y.K. Alak. And what was their major objective, or what was their the thing which you wrote in inverted comma was that projections of minimum needs and effective consumption demand. That was what their aimed for, and their first recommendation was this. They also had a second recommendation, that is the poverty line corresponding to the calorie requirement. Second recommendation, you can write second, the poverty line corresponding to the calorie requirement. The poverty line corresponding to the calorie requirement. So what was the calorie requirement? The calorie requirement was 2,400 kilocalorie. The calorie requirement was 2,400 kcal, kilocalorie. Kilocalorie. Per capita per day. Per capita per day in rural areas. Per capita per day in rural areas. And 2,100 kilocalorie. And 2,100 kilocalorie per capita per day in urban areas. 2,100 kilocalories per capita per day in urban areas. Okay, so these were their major recommendations, and you can note down their major points of criticisms as well. What were the criticisms they faced? The main points or the major points of criticism were the adjustment of procedure. The adjustment of procedure. It's also known as the adjustment procedure. Okay. Second point, the choice of deflators. The choice of deflators to represent price changes in the poverty line. The choice of deflators which they chose were not that good. So to represent price changes in the poverty line. Choice of deflators, that was one major criticism. Choice of deflators to represent price change in the poverty line. To represent price change in the poverty line. Use of a fixed consumption basket. Use of a fixed consumption basket. Use of a fixed consumption basket over time. And the uniform consumption basket for all the states. The uniform consumption basket for all the states. And the reasons why they received these criticisms were due to the fact that their adjustment procedure was not good. It was not falling in line to what India's poverty line estimation should have been at that point. The choice of deflators which we took, we already know about one deflator, that is the GDP deflator, right? It always measures one, or it always converts or measures one price, that can be current price to constant price. Okay. Likewise, the choice of deflators which the Alak committee chose was not that good, or were not matching with the estimates of what the poverty line was of at that time in India during the 1970s, 1980s period. They used a fixed consumption basket. Okay. They used a fixed consumption basket over time. The issue with this is that the consumption basket changes. Okay. As the consumption pattern and the consumption changes occur over time. Over time, all these things changes. So when you are using a fixed consumption basket, the problem is that you are not changing as the time progresses. So that was the reason why that criticism was raised. And they also used a uniform consumption basket for all the states. See, the consumption of person A might be different from that of consumption of person B. Okay, that's the basic concept that lies there. The consumption of different, or the consumption basket of one state, let it be Kerala, to that of Madhya Pradesh is different. It's not the same. The people are not the same. The way they consume is not the same. The consumption expenditure is different. Everything is different. So it was not apt to use a uniform consumption basket. And so that came as a criticism against them by the experts. Okay, so when you are analyzing the task force of 1907 by the ALA committee, you must be able to understand under whose able chairmanship was that introduced, or under what whose able chairmanship was the task force in. Why was it termed as the ALA committee? It was due to the fact that it was under the chairmanship of Dr. Y.K. ALA. What were their major objectives, or what were their major objective? What were their major recommendations? Did they face any criticism? If so, what? Okay. And the criticism were based due to, or where they face this criticism due to these factors, such and such factors, which we told right now. Okay. Even when they told that they made a division between rural and urban areas, if you look, 2,400 calories to 2,100 calorie. That was the rural to urban division they made. But still they have made a uniform consumption basket for all the states. Okay, so that state division was not made. Even when the rural-urban divide was clearly understood, that state division was not understood properly. That was the problem of the ALA committee. Criticisms faced by the ALA committee. Next is the expert group of 1993. Expert group of 1993. So the first was a working group, second was a task force, third is a expert group. Expert group of 1993, also known as the Lakdawala committee. LAKDAWALA. 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 Lakdawala committee. This is also known as the expert group of 1993. Lakdawala committee, okay? The planning commission in September 1989. The planning commission in September 1989 constituted the expert group. Constituted the expert group on estimation of proportion. On estimation of proportion and number of poor. On estimation of proportion and number of poor. Two. After that two, you can put an inverted comma. Okay. Look into the methodology of, or look into the methodology for, look into the methodology for estimation of poverty. Look into the methodology for estimation of poverty and to redefine the poverty line. And to redefine the poverty line. Comma, if necessary. And to redefine the poverty line, comma, if necessary. So the expert group submitted its report in July 1993. Okay, it submitted its report in 1993. The government again accepted the expert group's methodology. They also accepted the recommendations. So their first main thing regarding the expert group or the Lakdawala committee, when you're remembering, when you're studying it for the exams, please make sure that the first major thing which you have to understand and analyze is that they did not redefine the poverty line. Okay, they did not redefine the poverty line. It retained the one defined by the task force or the ALA committee. They did not redefine the poverty line. That means they followed the same poverty line criteria as that of what the ALA committee has stated. They took that same one as that of the ALA committee. That was in a proportion which we told earlier, as of in the case of rural and urban areas, that 2,400 is to 2,100 ratio. Okay. But there were certain differences which you can note down. The national rural poverty line, you can put a number 1 and write, okay? The national rural poverty line, the national rural poverty line of task force, that is of ALA committee. The national rural poverty line of the task force or ALA committee was disaggregated into state specific poverty lines. Into state specific poverty lines. Into state specific poverty lines. That's something which we have told right now. They use that same Ala committee state issue. The second point which you can write down is the national urban poverty line. The national urban poverty line of the task force was disaggregated. The national urban poverty line of the task force was disaggregated into state specific poverty lines. Into state specific poverty lines in a similar way. Into state specific poverty lines in a similar way. In a similar way as in the case of the rural poverty line, as in the case of the rural poverty line, using state specific price indices, using state specific price indices were constructed by taking state specific price indices were constructed by taking weighted average of the commodity group wise okay, of the commodity group wise. The third point, the national or all India poverty line in the expert group, the national or all India poverty line in the expert group was worked out as an interpolated value from the national consumption distribution obtained from the national consumption distribution obtained from the NSS consumer expenditure data. NSS is National Sample Survey, okay? NSS consumer expenditure data. NSS consumer expenditure data and the national poverty ratio. And the national poverty ratio. Okay, so their basic recommendations were mostly aligned with that of what the task force had set up in 1979. Okay, that is Lakdawala committee's recommendations were in line with that of the Alak committee's reports. But you can mainly state two factors that largely distinguish the expert group to that of the Alak committee. Okay, so you can write it down. Two factors which distinguished the expert group to that of the task force, or the major point of difference between these two committees, expert group and the Alak committee or the task force. Expert group and the task force. Okay. First point is that, did you all write it down? First point is that the expert group or the Lakdawala committee, they used state specific poverty. They used state specific poverty lines as against national poverty lines. They used state specific poverty lines as against national poverty lines for estimation of poverty in a state. For estimation of poverty in a state. For estimation as against national poverty line, as against national poverty line for estimation of poverty in a state. So what does it mean by that? The expert group, they were able to capture the cost of living in the state much more accurately than the task force or the ALA committee. Okay, you can write it now. It thereby captured the cost of living in the states. It thereby captured the cost of living in the states more accurately as compared to the task force. So did you understand what task force did? They used the national poverty line to even estimate the state poverty lines. That was the comparison that I made. But what the expert group of 1993 did was that they used the state specific poverty lines for each and every state, so that they had a much more understanding and much more accuracy in estimating the income levels or the poverty lines for each state. Okay. So that's the first point of difference. The second point of difference is that the expert group used the state-wise consumption distribution, used the state-wise consumption distribution of the National Sample Survey or the NSS, used the state-wise consumption distribution of the National Sample Survey or the NSS without any adjustment to NAS consumption. NAS is National Account Statistics. Okay. NAS is National Account Statistics. NAS is National Accounts Statistics. NAS consumption. NAS consumption. This is a major point of difference from the task force. This is a major point of difference from the task force. This is a major point of difference from the task force. As they did the adjustment on a pro ratio basis, on a pro rate basis. Okay, more precisely on a pro rate basis. So that was the second point of difference between the ALAC committee and the Lakdawala committee, or the task force and the expert group. The expert group, they did not, they used the state-wise consumption provided by the NSS, that is the National Sample Survey, without any adjustments to the NAS consumption made. They did not make any further adjustments to that. But what the previous committee, ALAC committee, did was that they made certain adjustments, and they made adjustments in such a way that they used the method of pro ratio basis. Okay, they took the ratio of that. They made adjustments to the NAS committee or the NAS consumption system, that is the National Account Statistics Consumption System, and that was their second point of difference. So whenever you're writing about this Lakdawala committee or this expert group of 1993, the points which you have to write down is their major recommendations, their objective, under whose able chairmanship is this committee working, what is National Sample Survey, and you have to write about NAS, that is the National Account Statistics, The major recommendations, the major points of difference. Okay. The major points of difference between Alak committee and the Lakdawala committee. So that's why I told you in the evolution process of this poverty line estimation, you have to write down each committee you analyze, each committee you take, you have to take into account the WH questions. What, where, when, why, how, what is the point of difference? Okay. These things you have to analyze. Next is the important recommendations. The important recommendations and estimates, important recommendations and estimates of the Planning Commission report of the Planning Commission expert group. Estimates of the Planning Commission expert group, which is also known as the Tendulkar Committee, which is also known as the Tendulkar Committee regarding poverty lines. So how many groups have we seen till now? We have seen the working group, the Alak committee, the Lakdawala committee, and now the Tendulkar committee. Okay. Tendulkar committee had a lot more recommendations than other groups. So you can write down the first recommendation. Poverty estimates to continue. Poverty estimates to continue to be based on. Poverty estimates to continue to be based on private household consumer expenditure or consumption expenditure. Private household consumption expenditure of Indian households private household consumer or consumption expenditure of Indian households collected by the National Sample Survey Organization or NSSO. National Sample Survey Organization. Expenditure of Indian households collected by the National Sample Survey Organization, NSSO. They also stated that there is a need to move away from. There is a need to that you can write it as second. You can write it as the second recommendation. There is a need to move away from. There is a need to move away from anchoring the poverty lines to a calorie intake norm. Anchoring the poverty lines to a calorie intake norm. Anchoring the poverty lines to a calorie intake norm. No, NORM. Next point was that norm. Anchoring the poverty lines to a calorie intake norm. Calorie intake norm. They gave much more focus to calorie intakes. Okay. The MRP equivalent of the urban poverty line basket. MRP equivalent of the poverty line basket, also known as PLB. PLB corresponding to 25.7%, corresponding to 25.7% urban headcount ratio, corresponding to 25.7% urban headcount ratio. Urban headcount ratio means the ratio of population below the poverty line in the urban area. Urban headcount ratio as the new reference of PLB. As the new reference of PLB. And that to be included. PLB is poverty line basket, okay? And that to be included. to the rural as well as urban population, to the rural as well as the urban population in all the states, after suitable adjustments. In all the states after suitable adjustments. Next point is the proposed reference PLB. The proposed reference PLB, that is poverty line basket. The proposed reference PLB takes into account all items of consumption, for construction of price indices. The next recommendation. The new poverty line seeks to enable the rural as well as urban population in all the states to afford the recommended all India urban PLB, to afford the recommended all India urban PLB, the all India urban PLB after taking due account of what? After taking due account of within, it's not what, okay, it's within, due account of within state rural urban, within state rural urban, within you put a hyphen, then write state, then rural you put a hyphen, then write urban, within state rural urban and interstate differentials by incorporating observed consumer behavior, both at all India and state levels. By observing consumer behavior, incorporating observed consumer behavior both at all India and state levels. Okay, so these were the major or the important recommendations of the Planning Commission Expert Group, also known as the Tendulkar Committee. So they were of the view that poverty estimates should be based on private household consumer expenditure. Okay, private household consumer expenditure of Indian households. That is the private consumption only, private consumption expenditure, which occurs within a household. That is from the consumption point of view, which is collected by the National Sample Survey Organization. And they also advocated, this is the second point, or the second recommendation is one of the major recommendations. They told that there is a need to move away from the anchoring the poverty lines to calorie intake norms. Okay, calorie intake norms should be given prior importance, should be given more importance. And they were of the view that there is a need to move away from anchoring the poverty lines to a calorie intake norm. Let you from in the previous committees, if you analyze, they gave more importance to nutritional norms. Okay, they also gave more importance to nutritional norms. So they of the view they were of the view that there is a need to anchor the poverty lines to a calorie intake norm. Okay, that was one thing which they did. That was their one of their recommendations. They also brought into light the concept of poverty line basket. Okay, poverty line basket is nothing but how many people fall into that basket of poverty line. How many people are involved in that? How many people fall below the poverty line? Their basket. A basket of forming the people of those who are falling below the poverty line are known as the poverty line basket. Okay. So, and they also took into account two major things: an urban headcount ratio. Till then, we did not have an urban headcount ratio. We have already told what headcount ratio is. What is headcount ratio? It is a ratio of people falling below the poverty line. Okay, ratio of people falling below the poverty line. So obviously, urban headcount ratio means it is the ratio of people falling below the poverty line in the urban areas. Okay, so they took into consideration the urban headcount ratio as well as the rural headcount ratio. They were also of the view that there should be an all India as well as a state poverty line. Separate all India and state poverty line. Okay. So these are the major recommendations of the Tendulkar committee. So in the Tendulkar committee, these recommendations, especially the second recommendation as well as the urban headcount ratio point, the poverty line basket point, and a separate all India and state level what poverty line points should be highlighted. Okay. So that's it regarding the Tendulkar committee. The next committee is the C. Rangarajan committee. C. Rangarajan committee. RANG, RAJN, Rangarajan. C. Rangarajan Committee, RANG, This is also a planning commission expert group, okay? Planning commission's expert group. First one was Tendulkar Committee. This one is C. Rangarajan Committee. So their first recommendation was that the poverty line should be based on certain normative levels of adequate nourishment. Certain normative levels of adequate nourishment. Certain normative levels of adequate nourishment, comma, clothing. Did you get that line? The poverty line should be based on certain normative levels of adequate nourishment, comma, clothing, house, rent, etc. Clothing, house, rent, etc. Okay. The Rangarajan committee, second point, the Rangarajan committee computed the average requirements of calorie. The Rangarajan committee computed the average requirements of calories, proteins, average requirements of calories, proteins and fats, FATs, okay, FATs, fats, based on ICMR norms. We have already told what ICMR is. It's the Indian Council of Medical Research. ICMR norms differentiated by age. ICMR norms differentiated by age, gender, age, comma, gender, and activity, for all India urban and rural regions. For all India urban and rural regions. For all India urban and rural regions. The protein and fat requirements. That's the next recommendation. Okay. The protein and fat requirements or you can even take it as a sub recommendation of the second point. The protein and fat requirements have been estimated. The protein and fat requirements have been estimated on the same lines as for energy. The protein and fat requirements have been estimated on the same lines as for energy. And these requirements are 48 grams. These requirements are 48 grams and 28 grams per capita per day. 48 grams and 28 grams per capita per day, respectively in rural areas. Okay, that's the case of rural areas. That's in rural areas. And 50 grams and 26 grams. And 50 grams and 26 grams. 50 is to 26. 50 is to 26 grams per capita per day in urban areas. 50 is to 26 per capita per day in urban areas. Okay. Next is a food basket. Next recommendation, a food basket, FUFOOD, food basket that simultaneously meets all the normative requirements of the three nutrients defines the food component of the poverty line, defines the food component of the poverty line, defines the food component of the poverty line basket proposed by the expert group. That is this expert group. Okay, that's the Rangarajan committee. Okay, next point. The new poverty line thus work out to monthly per capita consumption expenditure, of rupees 972. Monthly per capita consumption expenditure of rupees 972 in rural areas. And rupees 1,407 or 1,407 in urban areas. Next point, estimations of the poverty line. Made for the expert group. That's this committee. Okay, made for this committee. Estimations of the poverty line made for this committee based on an independent large survey based on an independent large survey of households using a different methodology wherein a household is considered poor, wherein a household is considered poor if it is unable to save, yields results YIELDS yields results that are remarkably close to those derived using the NSSO data. NSSO data. So someone please read these recommendations. Okay, so someone please summarize all these recommendations. That is, you can read from the book, from the working group of 1962. Maybe someone from the first bench. Yeah. From the working group of 1962. Please read it loudly, okay? So now you can take down two more recommendations of the Ragarajan committee. You can note it down. The national and urban, the national, rural and urban, the national, rural and urban poverty lines, the national, rural and urban poverty lines computed as above. Were used to derive the state-wise poverty lines by using the implicit price derived from the quantity by using the implicit price derived from the quantity and value of consumption observed in value of consumption observed in the NSSOs, that is NSSO apostrophe S, NSSOs 68th round of consumer expenditure survey. 68th round of consumer expenditure survey. And the last recommendation which you can note down is the expert group therefore estimates that 30.9% of the 30.9% of the rural population, 30.9% of the rural population and 26.4% of the urban population, 26.4% of the urban population was below the poverty line in 2011-12. Was below the poverty line in 2011-12. And totally 363 million and totally 363 million were below poverty in 2011-12. 363 million. And you can write down another statistics, okay, that is not related to this, but you can take it down. As per or according to UNDP, United Nations Development Program, according to UNDP, India lifted 271 million people. India lifted 271 million people out of poverty. India lifted 271 million people out of poverty between 2006 and 2016. 2006-2016 ഇടയ്ക്ക് ആ വർഷങ്ങൾക്കിടയ്ക്ക് 271 മില്യൺ ആൾക്കാരെ ഇന്ത്യ പോവർട്ടിയിൽ നിന്ന് ഉയർത്തിയിട്ടുണ്ട്. That's the report by UNDP. Okay, so we have seen different number of committees for the evaluation for the poverty line estimation. First one is the working group of 1962. So I have already told you, whenever you are studying about this group, you will tend to forget things. So do one thing, you understand the WH questions, what, where, when, and how. And so it will be easy for you to recollect it. The working group of 1962 followed by the ALEC committee of 1993. I mean, the ALEC committee of 79, 1993's Lakdawala committee, the Tendulkar committee report, and then the Rangarajan committee report. Okay, so you got five different types of groups, 5 different recommendations. So the Rangarajan committee has got a lot of recommendations. Tendulkar committee and Rangarajan committee are the most important among these. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't study working group and all. You must know that, but Rangarajan committee and Tendulkar committee are of utmost importance. So make sure you understand their key points, you understand their major objectives, their recommendations. Okay. And understand, as I told you, what, when was it formed, under whose able leadership, why was it formed, what were their major recommendations, were there any criticism. You understand that point, you have a deep analysis on each committee, and you will understand this. Okay, you'll be able to recollect it more. Okay, so go home and read these topics. So that's it for a day. I think you got a revision quiz yesterday also. Check your phones whether you have received one today also. So you complete that and you can go home. Okay, you all completed? You all completed. So those of you haven't completed it, please complete it and you may go. Those who have completed, you may go. So tomorrow, I think you will have a class on English, okay? English language and grammar. That will be taken by Prasad sir.